In 1932, Henry Ford walked into his Dearborn factory and did something that should have been impossible. He unveiled a V8 engine, 8 cylinders arranged in a V, cast as a single block of iron. Now, that doesn't sound revolutionary today, but in 1932, it was like showing up to a horse race with a jet engine. V8 engines existed, sure. Cadillac had one, Packard had one. But those were luxury machines, hand-built for the rich, costing more than most Americans made in a year. Ford's V8 was different. It cost $80. $80 for an engine that could push a car past 90 miles per hour, and it came standard in vehicles that working-class families could actually afford. This is the story of the Ford Flathead V8 and how a single engine, affordable, powerful, and endlessly modifiable, accidentally created an entire culture. Along the way, we'll encounter bootleggers outrunning federal agents, teenagers turning grocery-getter sedans into drag strip legends, and a generation of ordinary Americans who taught themselves to become engineers in their own garages. So let's begin. But first, what made this engine so special, and why did it matter that Ford made it? To understand the Flathead, you need to understand what engines looked like before 1932. Most affordable cars ran 4-cylinder engines. They were simple, reliable, and slow. Chevy had a 6-cylinder that was decent enough but nothing special. If you wanted real power, you needed a V8, and V8s were expensive. The reason was manufacturing. A V8 has 8 cylinders arranged in 2 banks of 4, forming a V shape. Traditional manufacturing required casting each cylinder bank separately, then bolting them together with a crankcase in the middle. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and required skilled craftsmen. The engines worked beautifully, but they cost a fortune. Henry Ford hated that. He'd built his empire on the idea that manufacturing innovation could make expensive things cheap. The Model T had proven it. Through assembly line production, he'd taken automobiles from rich men's toys to everyday transportation. By the late 1920s, though, Ford was in trouble. The Model T was outdated. Chevrolet was eating into his market share. Ford needed something dramatic. His engineers told him a monoblock V8, all 8 cylinders and the crankcase cast as one piece of iron, was impossible. The metallurgy didn't work. The cooling would be uneven. The casting would crack. Ford told them to figure it out anyway. I mention this because what happened next changed everything. Ford's team, led by engineers like Carl Schultz and Emil Zorlein, spent years failing. They tried different iron mixtures. They experimented with mold designs. They built prototype after prototype, and each one cracked, warped, or simply didn't work. Ford kept pushing. He'd walk through the experimental department, look at the latest failure, and say something like, "That's fine, try again." Finally, in 1932, they got it right. The Ford Flathead V8, officially the Ford Model 18 engine, went into production. It displaced 221 cubic inches and produced 65 horsepower. Those numbers seem modest now, but context matters. The average car in 1932 made maybe 40 horsepower. The Flathead was 50% more powerful than anything in its price range. And Ford priced the V8-equipped Model 18 at just $460, barely more than his 4-cylinder models. The thing is, raw numbers don't capture why the Flathead mattered. It wasn't just powerful, it was accessible. The engine sat in the same chassis Ford had been building for years, which meant parts were everywhere. The design was simple. Flathead meant the valves sat in the engine block rather than in the cylinder head, which made the whole thing easier to build, easier to maintain, and easier to modify. Now Ford didn't realize that last part would matter. He thought he was building an engine for farmers and salesmen and families. He had no idea he was handing American teenagers the keys to a revolution. At any rate, let's talk about what happened when the Flathead hit the streets. The first people to really understand the Flathead's potential weren't teenagers at all. They were criminals. Specifically, they were bootleggers, the men who smuggled illegal whiskey through the rural South during Prohibition. See, bootlegging wasn't just about making moonshine, it was about moving it. And moving it meant outrunning the law. Bootleggers needed cars that looked ordinary but performed like nothing else on the road. They needed to blend in at a glance, then disappear the moment a sheriff appeared in the rearview mirror. Before 1932, they'd modify whatever they could get their hands on, stripped-out Fords, hopped-up Chevys, but the Flathead changed everything. Here was an engine that came from the factory with real power, sitting in an ordinary-looking sedan. Better yet, you could make it faster. Bootleggers discovered that the Flathead responded beautifully to modification. Mill the heads and you'd increase compression, which meant more power. Swap the carburetor and you'd get better fuel delivery. Add dual exhausts and the engine breathed easier. These weren't complicated modifications. They didn't require machine shops or engineering degrees. A clever mechanic with basic tools could wring an extra 20, 30, even 40 horsepower out of a stock Flathead. Junior Johnson, who'd later become a NASCAR legend, grew up running moonshine in a Flathead-powered Ford. He'd drive at night with his headlights off, memorizing every curve of the Carolina backroads, his modified engine pulling away from anything the feds could throw at him. When asked about it later, he said the Flathead made him. Without that engine, he'd have been just another country boy. With it, he was untouchable. The bootleggers weren't the only ones who noticed. The police noticed. The FBI noticed. Even John Dillinger noticed. The famous bank robber wrote Ford a letter thanking him for the V8. "I have drove Fords exclusively when I could get away with one," Dillinger wrote. "For sustained speed and freedom from trouble, the Ford has got every other car skinned." Ford never responded publicly, but you have to imagine he had mixed feelings about that particular testimonial. But anyway, Prohibition ended in 1933, just a year after the Flathead debuted. The bootleggers didn't disappear, though. They kept driving, kept modifying, kept racing each other on back roads for bragging rights and beer money, and their knowledge spread. The tricks they'd learned, how to extract power from the Flathead, how to tune it for performance, how to make it reliable under stress, that knowledge filtered out into the broader culture. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, and hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the bootleggers were just the beginning. The Flathead stayed in production from 1932 to 1953. That's 21 years of the same basic engine, refined over time, but fundamentally unchanged. By the time production ended, Ford had built over 25 million of them. 25 million. That number matters because it means Flatheads were everywhere. Junkyards were full of them. Used car lots were full of them. Your neighbor probably had one rusting behind his garage. This abundance created something unprecedented, a massive pool of cheap, powerful engines that anyone could experiment with. A teenager in 1946, freshly home from World War II, or just old enough to drive, could buy a beat-up 1936 Ford Coupe for almost nothing. The engine might need work, but parts were everywhere, and knowledge was spreading. This is where the hot rod movement really began. The term hot rod probably came from hot roadster, a stripped-down car modified for speed, but nobody's completely sure. What everyone agrees on is that it started in Southern California. The dry lakebeds outside Los Angeles provided perfect natural racetracks, flat and endless, where young men could push their modified cars to the limit without worrying about traffic or cops. These weren't rich kids with expensive toys. They were working-class guys, mechanics, laborers, returning veterans, who'd learned engine basics in shop class or the military, and now applied that knowledge to making their cars faster. The Flathead was their canvas. It was cheap, available, and responded to modification like nothing else. Think about what this meant. Before the Flathead, automotive performance was the province of professionals and the wealthy. If you wanted a fast car, you bought one from a manufacturer who built fast cars. You didn't modify a family sedan into a race machine because family sedans didn't have the potential for it. The Flathead changed that equation. Suddenly, speed was democratic. If you had $50, some tools, and a willingness to learn, you could build something fast. The knowledge wasn't locked away in engineering schools or corporate research departments. It spread through magazines like Hot Rod, which launched in 1948, and through informal networks of enthusiasts who shared tips at drive-ins and junkyards. The aftermarket industry exploded. Companies like Edelbrock, Offenhauser, and Wyand began manufacturing performance parts specifically for the Flathead: intake manifolds, cylinder heads, camshafts. You could buy a catalog and order parts by mail. Each piece promised more horsepower, and most of them delivered. A stock 1948 Flathead made around 100 horsepower. A well-built modified Flathead could make 200 or more, double the factory output from the same basic engine. I love this part of the story, honestly. Here's why. These weren't engineers. Not formally, anyway. They were self-taught, learning through trial and error, building their own knowledge base from scratch. They'd try something, see if it worked, share the results with their friends. If a modification made your car faster, word got around. If it blew up your engine, word got around about that too. The thing is, failure was cheap. A blown Flathead meant a trip to the junkyard for another one. The abundance of engines meant you could experiment without risking financial ruin. This low barrier to failure encouraged innovation. People tried things that professionals never would have attempted simply because they didn't know any better. And sometimes those attempts worked. The dry lake races formalized into organized events. The Southern California Timing Association set up courses on the Mojave Desert lakebeds, measuring speeds with timing equipment and keeping records. The fastest guys became celebrities within the community. Their car builds were studied and copied. Competition drove innovation. By the late 1940s, the hot rod scene had grown too big to ignore. The mainstream press noticed, usually to write panicked articles about juvenile delinquents racing on public streets. There was some truth to that. Street racing was real and dangerous. People died. But the organized lakebed racing was surprisingly safe, and the community worked hard to separate legitimate enthusiasts from reckless kids. The National Hot Rod Association formed in 1951 partly to provide a legitimate outlet for racing and partly to clean up the sport's image. Wally Parks, a hot rod magazine editor, was instrumental in this. He understood that hot rodding needed organization if it was going to survive. Drag strips started appearing around the country, purpose-built facilities where you could race legally and safely. And guess what powered most of those early drag cars? Flatheads. The same engine Ford had designed for family sedans was now winning races and setting records. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Flathead created a generation of amateur engineers. These guys, and they were almost all guys, though some women were involved too, taught themselves metallurgy, fluid dynamics, thermodynamics. They didn't call it that. They called it porting and polishing, jetting carburetors, advancing timing. But the underlying principles were the same. They were doing engineering without degrees, solving complex problems through experimentation and shared knowledge. Some of them went on to professional careers. Vic Edelbrock, whose father had founded Edelbrock Equipment, grew up in that world and turned a small speed shop into a major automotive aftermarket company. Ed Iskandarian, Iski, started grinding camshafts in his garage and built Iski racing cams into an industry leader. These companies still exist today, still serving performance enthusiasts, their roots traced directly back to Flathead modification. The Flathead era ended, technically, in 1953. Ford introduced the overhead valve Y-block V8, which was more modern and more powerful. Chevrolet followed in 1955 with the small block V8, an engine so good it's still in production today. The Flathead became obsolete almost overnight. But here's the thing, the culture it created didn't die. The hot rod movement had grown too large, too entrenched, too important to disappear just because the original engine was outdated. The skills people had developed modifying flatheads transferred to the new engines. The community networks remained. The magazines kept publishing. The aftermarket companies adapted. More importantly, the fundamental idea survived, that ordinary people could take ordinary machines and make them extraordinary. That performance wasn't the exclusive domain of the wealthy or the professional, that a working-class kid with determination and creativity could build something faster than anything coming out of Detroit. That idea shaped American car culture for the next 70 years. Muscle cars, tuner culture, modern hot rodding, all of it traces back to those first modified flatheads screaming across dry lakebeds in the California desert. And what of the flathead itself? Its legacy is complicated. Enthusiasts still run them today at nostalgia drag races and vintage events. A well-preserved original flathead is worth good money. But the engine's real legacy isn't in the metal. It's in what it taught people, that they could be more than consumers, that they could be creators, that the machine in their garage was a starting point, not a finished product. Henry Ford never intended any of this. He wanted to sell cars to farmers and families. He wanted to prove that American manufacturing could do the impossible. He succeeded at both, but he also accidentally created something he never imagined, a generation of working-class Americans who looked at a factory product and thought, I can make this better. The bootleggers figured it out first. The hot rodders systematized it. The aftermarket industry commercialized it. But it all started with a single decision in a Dearborn factory, the decision to cast a V8 engine as one piece of iron and sell it cheap. Some innovations change what we drive. The Flathead changed who we are when we drive. It turned consumers into enthusiasts, buyers into builders, ordinary people into engineers. For $20 in parts and a weekend in the garage, you could be faster than the guy next to you at the stoplight. You could be part of something. That's what the Ford Flathead V8 really gave America. Not just an engine, a culture, an identity, a way of thinking about machines that says they're not finished until you make them yours. And that culture, that democratic, rebellious, endlessly creative culture, is still with us today. Every time someone bolts on a cold air intake or programs a custom ECU tune, they're following a tradition that started with those first bootleggers and lakebed racers. They're participating in something that's almost a century old now, something that began when Henry Ford's engineers finally figured out how to cast a monoblock V8. The Flathead may be obsolete, but its spirit never died. It just evolved. And every garage-built project car, every backyard mechanic learning through trial and error, every teenager dreaming of making something faster than it was before, that's the Flathead's real legacy. Not bad for an $80 engine. And that is the story of the Ford Flathead V8. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard about the Flathead's connection to bootlegging before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.